The recording studio. What is it? And what is it that people do there? An interview with veteran arranger-conductor Nick Ingman by fellow musician Keith McFarlane.
So this is Nick Ingman, who's been in a recording studio just a few times. Do you want to tell us a little bit about any recording studios you've been in, perhaps Abbey Road?
Yes, there are quite a few recording studios, not as much as there was, let's say 20, 30, 40 years ago when there were literally hundreds. There's only really now probably under half a dozen. Of those, maybe only 3 are the mainstream ones. There's quite a few tiny rock and roll ones, but the 3 main ones are Abbey Road, Angel and Air.
And we're talking about London at the moment.
Yeah, there are very few studios out of London, and mostly they're residential semi-rock and roll studios.
When you say rock and roll studio, do you mean it's owned by Paul McCartney's son and he's got a studio at the back of his house? Or
Sometimes they're personalised, but sometimes they're just very, very small and can only accommodate 3 or 4 people. And as I say, mostly they're residential, where people literally live there for maybe months and get up in the morning and go into the studio.
Oh, wow. Didn't realise that happens. Wonderful. So, Joe Bloggs decides he wants to make a recording. What people are involved in planning a recording session?
Well, Joe Bloggs would have to be under contract to a recording company, a record company. Very, very, very few individuals use recording studios as an individual. The costs are just too high. So,
can you give us a vague idea about costs?
No, I can't, because it's a huge register, a huge range, which I can certainly talk to. But just go back to your question. So Joe Blow would be under contract, or his group, or his band, or whatever. So he that is the starting point, and it's the recording company that book all the things and people that we're about to talk about. So that's where you start, is the record company, and they will contact any one of the studios, either the tiny ones or the big ones, according to their project, and book time in the studio. And there is a person in most of the big studios where they have a bookings department, and the record company or the designated man from the record company would ring up and say, I want to book 3 days at Studio 1 or wherever, and please can you pencil that in, and I'll confirm it later. So that's the first step. Then having booked the time, again back to the record company, the executives, and they're known as A and R, which is artists and repertoire.
I was going to ask you about them.
Who are in charge of one particular project. They're answerable only to the boss of the record company, who's the final decider because of budget. So the A&R man in question would go, as I say, to book a studio. His next step is to decide what studio, depending on what kind of project it is. If it's Joe Blow and his 3 mates, then they would probably go into one of the smaller studios. Although if the budget is healthy, then they would go into, for instance, Abbey Road, which has 3 studios, one of which is quite small and therefore appropriate for pop and rock. If the project is much bigger than that, i.e. orchestral, then the A&R man, would book a much bigger studio, for instance, Studio 1 at Abbey Road, which can accommodate up to 100 people, or Studio 2, which can accommodate about 60. And again, over to Air Lyndhurst, which has 2 studios. It's either 100-piece, or in the smaller studio, it's about 60-piece. And Angel, finally, which is now owned by Abbey Road, and only now, it used to have 2 studios, only has 1 studio upstairs, which can accommodate about 40 people. Downstairs is now a school for engineers.
Oh.
So the next step would be to book the time, as I say, depending on the project. If it's a pop act, it probably would be 2 or 3 days of recording, laying down the basic tracks with various what they call overdubs, which is where you add different instruments to the basic track. And then the process of mixing, which is to reduce the tracks that you've recorded, probably on 34/24 track, to reduce them down to stereo.
We're going to come to mixing later on.
All right.
Can I ask, I believe there's someone called a fixer. What do they do?
Okay, fixer is a slang word for orchestral contractor. This is somebody who, if you need an orchestra, you go to one of the many orchestral contractors, if we're talking about London, in London, to book whatever size orchestra you need. Could be a string quartet, or it could be a 100-piece symphony orchestra. So that person or that company would then go through the quite complicated process of contracting and contacting the musicians who are relevant. The fixers, the contractors, use a thing called a diary service, which is a freelance service that you ring and you say, I want this name, this name, this name, this name, and the diary then has contact details of the musicians that are being asked for, and send out a generalized text or email to those musicians to book them. So the contractor will then have told the musicians what to do and when to turn up and what fees they're going to make. The contractor will take generally 10% of the overall budget, and will also attend the actual recording sessions to make sure that everybody's happy, and more particularly that the musician union rules, which are very stringent, are being adhered to. And if they're not, then something has to be discussed. That person also has to deal with the problems, or if there are problems, of overtime. If there's any disagreements, then they have to be voiced at that stage, and that person would be there to be the arbiter of that.
Are there internationally agreed standards for making recordings?
It's not so much internationally agreed, it's that recording technology is now universal across the world. And that's really because, as of about 25 years ago, everything stopped being analog and became digital, which means that huge amounts of information can be stored very easily, and therefore a recording made in London can easily be transferred to San Francisco, and it's the same technology, and there's no deterioration of the product. It is exactly as it left the origin, and that's now pretty much, as I say, standard across the world.
Can I stop you there for a second? And isn't it also true that someone can sit in a studio in San Francisco and play his or her instrument and it be recorded in London?
Yeah, that's a slightly different technique.
But it can happen.
It can and does happen a lot. This is slightly different. This is known as ISDN, which is where, as you say, somebody in one place can talk to somebody in another place. It's like having a very, very high quality phone call, where the music as such is transferred via digit to the respondent.
Sorry to interrupt you there. So really we're talking about what the recording machine uses, and that's pretty much the same all over the world.
Yes, the standard equipment now is called Pro Tools, which started, as I say, about 20 years ago. Pro Tools is a computer which stores, again, digital information, a huge amount. Pro Tools can be used to manipulate the material, make it faster, slower, lower, higher, and in the studio there is a dedicated person who is the Pro Tools operator, and he or she is there all the time alongside the engineer, making sure that the recording is being taken in by the Pro Tools.
That leads me on to the next question I was going to ask, was who does what in a recording studio. So certainly there's a person, doing the Pro Tools, is it?
Mm-hmm.
And then a recording engineer. Is that the person who sits behind a desk and pushes levers up and down?
Yeah, he'd hate being described like that, but yeah, he's a very highly paid technician who sits behind the control desk. And in the hierarchy of what's going on there, he is the boss, he's the top guy. Second command is the Pro Tools operator, who is answerable to the engineer, so is his lieutenant, if you like. And further down the line, there's a number of people who basically are, can we go and get a coffee, please, or can we replace the fruit? So there's a number of people involved, but those are the two principles.
What about, there's someone called a producer?
A record producer who is either hired by the artists, or more likely by the record company, who will hire this person to oversee the recording in all its aspects, including rehearsals, deciding the material, working with the artist beforehand, and in the day of recording, standing by next to the engineer and giving him instructions about what is needed. He then is also in charge of the follow-up, which is the mixing process, and finally, right at the end, deciding the label, what they call label copy, which is what is printed on the CD cover, the artwork and so on, and presenting the final package to the record company. He or she will be on a percentage. It varies hugely depending on the clout of the producer, but it could be as little as 5%, it could be as much as 20%. And their royalties are rolling. So in other words, if the CD sells one copy, then he gets very little. If it sells 2 million, then he gets a great deal more. And there are various opinions about the usefulness or otherwise of the producer.
The general public, I think it's fair to say, is quite often sees photographs of people in recording studios with big microphones and the drummer in a glass cage. Does that still happen?
It very much depends on the material that's being recorded. So if it's, let's call it a straight-foot orchestral session, in other words, they could be playing Beethoven or a film score, then it's just the orchestra is laid out in a standard form, which has been going on for years and predates recording, goes back to the Middle Ages. And then the microphones are what they call distant mics, which means there are only one or two mics in the whole room picking up the sound, which is therefore a precise duplication of what's being played in the room. So there's no need for lots of mics. It would just be one or two up in the high part of the roof. You mentioned the drummer. Well, if it's a rock kind of material that we're talking about, then yes, the rhythm section, and that could include the drummer, would be housed in what they call a booth, which is separate from the main room, so that the sound the drummer is making can be completely isolated and doesn't what they call spill into the big room. So, and loud things like guitars and bass guitars and so on would be housed in a similar booth. Also, very, very, very delicate instruments, like for instance the harp, might also be housed in the same booth for the opposite reason, that it's so quiet that it needs special treatment. So yes, so that's the picture that most people have of a recording studio, of lots of people in a big room with a few mics, and as you say, sometimes the drummer in the booth.
And recording studios have to be completely silent, presumably, to make a recording. And do they have things like any form of baffling or things to absorb sound?
Well, each of the big studios are acoustically treated. Abbey Road was in fact a house in the 1920s and was bought by EMI in the 30s and completely obviously refurbished to become what we know. And obviously in that refurbishment was a huge amount of restructuring of rooms and acoustics. there is actually quite an odd thing going on at Abbey Road in Studio 2, which is the famous studio where the Beatles did most of their work. In the early 30s, one of the acoustic engineers was on holiday in Alaska, and he collected a bag of Alaskan seaweed and was convinced that this seaweed was acoustically enhancing, and took the seaweed and put it into a kind of a blanket and hung it on the walls of Studio 2. No one has dared take these down in case the acoustic of the room changes. So these very now filthy blankets are now hanging on the walls of Studio 2. And as I say, no one dare touch them.
So, I've heard that mixing is the most important part of a recording. Can you tell us a bit about what happens during the mixing process?
Well, it is pretty much as important as the recording, I would say, but what it technically is, most recording now is multi-track. That is, the music is disseminated across a large number of tracks. So you might have the bass on track 1, the drums on track 2, guitar on track 3, etc., etc., etc. That gets hugely complicated, and it could be up to hundreds of different tracks now that Pro Tools can accommodate so many.
Hundreds?
Well, in the old days...
16-track tape recorder?
Well, the Beatles' first recording was made on a 4-track machine. And gradually went up to 8, 16 and 24 and even 32. But now that's all redundant and we're on digital, so yes, Pro Tools can handle all that. So you've got to bring all those number of tracks into a parcel, a package of listenable material. So the process now is to take each track, examine it, make sure that it's processed, that is with the right EQ, equalization, the right reverb, etc., and then move on to the next track and so on and so forth. So it's a huge jigsaw puzzle. And this is also where mistakes can be rectified. So if we get to the bass track and we find that on bar 8 he played a wrong note, then we can go in and with Pro Tools technology we can change that note. Again, if there's something that's sped up, we can slow it down and so on. So it's a hugely rebuild, if you like, of the basic product.
Can I just ask if someone's singing sharp and that could be corrected as well? Or?
Okay, so that's a whole another area. It's fine. It's part of the mixing process.
Right.
About 10 years ago, technology started to come in with what is generically known as auto-tune. That is, you can take a vocal performance and you can do anything you like with it. If it's sharp, you can make it flat, etc. You can take away the sibilance, for instance, if the singer is too much S sound. You can rebuild that vocal. And I would say 90% of pop vocals that you hear on the radio have been auto-tuned. And so very, very, very few artists now sing live without being altered. Possibly Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney are the only exceptions. And it's got to the extent where now so-called live performances, most of the vocal performances that you're hearing are being pushed through an auto-tune. So again, there are many things you can do with the vocal, and people have been caught out in the past where they're doing live shows and the auto-tune machine breaks, and there are many occasions which I can't tell you about for libel laws. But so it's another part of the mix process. And then you have got all sorts of things like panning, which means as most recordings now when they end up are in stereo, where you position the various elements in the recording. So if it's a pop recording, the general rule is that vocals are in the middle, the bass is slightly to the left, guitar slightly to the right, and so on and so forth. So how you listen to it in your front room is predetermined in the mix process. About 30 years ago, there was a short trial of what they called quadraphonics, which was a 4-way thing. So you sat in your living room and you had sound coming from you from the front and from the back. It didn't last very long because it was extremely expensive and nobody really cared. So yes, mixing is very important. It's where the producer will have maybe the last say, because the artist will have different opinions. The A&R man, back to him for a minute, will have opinions about the mix. Many records are mixed several different times because of disagreements or different of opinion.
Very interesting.
That was a Mac Nick production.